Hello everyone, Spark Simulations here. Today we're going to be doing a quick sort of tutorial, or maybe this might be your first flight, or you've been flying around, just sort of playing around with the game, and now you want to have a look at how to use some avionics and make a flight plan, get a little bit more structure to your flying. So one thing that I want you to do before we actually get into the aircraft is come on over to the marketplace, and then you're going to search for NXI. Now, this is an updated version of the Garmin 1000 that adds a lot of functionality. It is free to download, and I strongly recommend you picking that up. It gets updated regularly as well. So just go ahead, you can click on that, and then you would have the install button to install it. That way you'll be looking at the same screens as me. So our flight today, what we're going to be doing is taking off from Boulder in Colorado, and we're just going to be flying up to Fort Collins. Now, I'm not going to do the flight plan in here, which you can if you want. You can even turn on all the nav aids, so you can start picking waypoints, or you can always search for waypoints as well by clicking on here and then selecting them and click add and go through, and that way it'll be in the GPS when you're loaded onto the runway. Typically I find it easier to do it actually in the aircraft, and adds a little bit of immersion to the flight sim and actually learning how to operate the G1000 as it's intended to be. So we'll go ahead and click fly, and we'll jump on into the aircraft, do a quick flight plan, and get in the air. Okay, so here we are in wonderful Boulder, Colorado. We have the Flatirons just off to our southwest there. We're lined up on runway 26, ready to fly. So let's just go ahead and jump on into the cockpit, and we're already fired up. This is the way it would be if you just selected to be on the runway already. If you select a parking spot, you're going to be what's called cold and dark, and you'll have to go through your startup procedures. So we're going to go ahead and come on down to our second PFD, which is over here. And to get a flight plan in, you're just going to click the FPL. That's going to bring up this screen. Now, this isn't a touch screen, so you can't click anywhere on it to activate points. So you have to use, I'm going to get this controls out of the way. There we go. You have to use the cursor knob here. So if you push it in, it'll bring up the cursor, and then your outer knob will rotate through the selections. So we want to go and first select where we're at. So we're at KBDU. So there's two ways to do this. You can go through and rotate the knob to select, and then your outer knob moves to the next field. Come over, do it all that way. The nice thing with this NXI is this isn't what they have in the real one, but they added it in for the flight simulator. That if you click on this little icon, that actually enables your keyboard. So then we can do BDU and finish it off. You have to unclick the keyboard, and then you can go ahead and hit enter to accept. We're not worried about putting in the runway. Go ahead and enter. Now, en route, we're not going to add anything in there because it's a short flight, and our approach, which we'll get to in a minute, is going to take care of all the waypoints that we need to. Say you were having a longer flight or a more complex flight, all you would do is enter in those waypoints just like we did with the origin airport. So we're just going to come on down to destination, and again, you're going to rotate this inner knob to bring up the screen. Click on the keyboard button, and we're going to Fort Collins, which is KFNL. And then turn off the keyboard button, hit enter, and again, not worried about runway. That's just drawn a straight line from where we are to where we want to go. Now, that's not going to line us up with the runway. We're not going to have a guided entrance to the runway, and so we need what's called an approach. So if we come on down to procedures here, we can go ahead and close our flight plan now. But if we come on down to procedures, we want to select the approach, and it's going to give you a bunch of options. Last I checked on the weather for Fort Collins, it was just listed as con, and the ATIS was saying that they were using runway 33 for any ILS approaches, or sorry, any any approaches. They weren't using runway 15, they were using runway 33. We want to do an RNAV, which is basically a GPS. You can use an ILS as well. It's a little bit slightly different functionality, a little bit more accurate, because this is something that is based actually at the airport on the runway. But this is an LPV RNAV, which is the most accurate one. You can see it brought up a whole bunch of different sort of like points coming off of this. Well, you can see this is our aircraft. We're just here, and once you click enter to select that, it's going to come down to now what's called your transition. How do you want to transition into the approach? Well, if we look, hygiene is right to the north of us. So we'll go ahead and scroll down and select hygiene. You can see now it's got hygiene over to Amami, then Conroy, Judet, and then on to runway 33. That's the one we want. We'll go ahead and select that. We don't need to worry about minimums. We don't need to pop that in, and then we can just go ahead and load it. So now you can see our flight plan is from Boulder to Fort Collins, but then it's got our approach underneath there with those waypoints loaded in. It also gives you altitudes that it wants you to be at for those waypoints in order to capture what's called the glide slope, which is going to guide us vertically down to the runway. So that's really all you need to do to get a flight plan in. If we zoom out, you can see now it's got us going up to hygiene, over to Imami, then Conroy, Judet, and then runway 33. The NXI also puts in your missed approach. If you were to miss that, you would then have a circling pattern out here, but we don't need to worry about that. So we'll go ahead and zoom back in here. Next thing I want to do is get our autopilot set up. So if you come on over here, let's go ahead and get the controls out of the way again. So this is sort of all your autopilot buttons, and then you have some knobs to sort of change the settings on your autopilot. So what I like to do before takeoff is just get our altitude set, which will be displayed here. So if you rotate the outer knob, that's going to go in thousands of feet, and then the inner knob is going to go by hundreds of feet. We just want to go to 8,000. Now, the other thing that we do after we take off is that once we turn on autopilot, it's just going to hold us at the heading that we turned autopilot on level. The other thing is that we need to tell it how to get to 8,000 feet. Typically, I like to have my climb initiated, clear any obstacles, go ahead and hit vertical speed first, which is going to lock in whatever vertical speed you're flying at. Thing is, it will dip the nose for a minute, and then it will catch back up to that setting you put in. Now, heading mode is going to be based off of your heading bug. You can see this heading button here. As I turn it, you can see that this little cyan is moving. Now, in order to get it directly what we're flying, which we're at the runway heading, which is what we want, if you just click on it, it automatically syncs to your current heading. So that's a very basic way to get your autopilot set up for takeoff. The last thing I want to say is that currently we're in live weather. Now, live weather means that typically there's going to be a barometric pressure that is different than the standard 29.92. And I can also tell that because this airport is typically around 5,300 feet. So we can go ahead and hit the shortcut key B for barometric on the keyboard, and that is going to go ahead and set our barometric pressure to 30.35. And then you can see adjusted our altitude to be correct, because otherwise we would take off level off at 8,000, which would end up being about 7,000. I think we were about like 4,800. So we were, about 500 feet different. So we'd only be at 7,500 feet. Um, so all that being sort of set, we have our flight plan in, autopilot configured. We can go ahead and come up to our main view here. For takeoff, all we really want to do, if you load onto the runway here, you're already going to be fired up and ready to go. We just want to turn off the parking brake. I like to just make sure that if you're using a joystick or a yoke or anything like that, I just like to rotate through everything and make sure it feels correct. It feels coordinated. And I also think I don't know if this is true, but I also feel like it makes sure that everything is centered. There's nothing that's uncalibrated. So I recommend go ahead and doing that. So we're going to go ahead and take off. And then our first step is going to be hit that vertical speed button once we're about 300 to 500 feet of altitude above the ground. So we're looking at 5,600 feet. We'll go ahead and click that on. Something else to look at on the ribbon here for our airspeed, we have an R there for rotation. Once we go ahead and pass the R, we can start our rotate, and that'll get us into the air. Now I like to come up to a little bit more of a nose-up view and a little bit closer while I'm going through my takeoff. So we're just going to kind of carry this climb out. Just past 2,400 feet. We're clear of the runway. 2,500 feet. Going up to 2,600 feet. And we can go ahead and click vertical speed. It hasn't turned on autopilot yet, but you can see it left that blue little tick mark there. So if we go ahead and click on autopilot now, it's going to, like I said, it sort of dips down and then it comes up. And that's why you need to be sort of like set, well, sort of get your initial climb out. Now, these buttons here will do nose up and nose down. So we can go ahead and click nose up, and this is going to change us up to 600. Now we're currently flying directly at these mountains. So we want to go ahead and hit heading bug, which is going to turn us back over to our original 262 that we set. And then you want to go ahead and rotate this, which is going to basically, for lack of a better term, use autopilot in like a manual mode, really, where you're just kind of controlling the aircraft using the heading bug. Now, this is our flight plan in this sort of magenta line. We want to join that at about a 45-degree angle. So we can go ahead and take this on over and enter that roughly around 45 degrees there. Once we get to that, we're going to go ahead and click our nav button, which is going to be for navigation, which means that we're going to start flying on our flight plan that we have tuned in for our nav. That is tuned in for GPS, which is what we loaded this in as. So, we've got a little ways to go before we actually get over there, so we will just sort of fly along and join back in once we are getting ready to turn on to that. Okay, so a couple things to look at here. We are getting close to the magenta line. We're passing 7,500 feet, and remember we've got it set to 8,000. This will automatically level off once we hit that. This green section up here is basically showing us what we have configured. So we're currently flying heading Autopilot is turned on, vertical speed at 600 feet per minute, and we do have an altitude armed, but it is not in green yet. So I already passed the line by describing that to you, but that's okay. We can go ahead and click nav, and it's actually going to turn us back to join up onto the course. So even if you pass it, you can always turn it on. So with heading mode, it doesn't care what the flight plan is. It'll just keep on flying that same exact heading. You can see it's just turned us now to join at a 45-degree angle that way. You can see that this just swapped over from vertical speed to alt mode, which is basically saying, hey, you've leveled off now at 8,000. You can see that we are now joining our flight plan that is going to take us up to hygiene. Now, a couple things to point out here is if we come down to our main PFD, there's some PFD options that I like to turn on. One I already have turned on, which is the wind, but if you click on wind, you can have it off so it doesn't show up. Option 1 just kind of does this little crosshair thing. Option 2 is just sort of the direction, and then the speed. Option 3 gives you the actual, degrees of the wind and the speed. So I like that one. Now, if you go back, there's another setting that you have your bearing here. So if we go ahead and click bearing, this is doing for your nav 1, nav 2, if you're using your ADF, but we want it on a GPS. And it's saying, okay, hygiene, you're 1.3 miles away at a heading of 8 degrees. If we come over to our second PFD, it will also give us that information here where we got 30 seconds until we're hitting it. We're currently cruising along at 125 knots, which is really, we need to set our cruise settings and slow down a little bit here. But we'll come up to the main view and you'll see as we pass hygiene, it's just going to go ahead and start that bank. There it goes. It turned us over. And then the next line is going to turn purple, which is going to be from hygiene to that Amami. And then you can see that everything got updated down here. It's now giving us the new waypoint, giving us the distance, the heading that it currently is to us. And then over on our second PFD, you can see that it's giving us the track and actually our direct track, and then our time to get there. We're currently flying a little bit too fast because we're in the red really on our RPM, so I'm looking up here. You don't want to keep these pegged like this. You want to slow it down. So a nice performance cruise in this is about 2,400 RPMs. So we'll slow that down as you hear the engine just sounds much happier. I'm also going to adjust our mixture a little bit to get a little bit better performance out of the aircraft. So we've got another 5 minutes before we get there. So same again, we're just going to kind of cruise along until we get to the next waypoint. Now we do have to drop about 400 feet because we do want to be at 7,600. Another way to see that is what's considered a VNAV, which we won't go over today because it's not always on every flight plan, but you can see 7,600 is in magenta, which means it is kind of loaded but not armed. If it was green, it would be sort of loaded in. But we'll just descend down 400 feet before we get to the next waypoint. So as you can see, the cloud coverage has moved in, which is kind of nice for us because we are going to be doing a guided approach, which will help us get through these clouds and line up for the runway. So we'll go ahead and hop back on into the cockpit here. And what we want to do is go ahead and start that 400-foot descent. So all you need to do is go ahead and click that vertical speed button again here. That's going to set it to wherever you're at, which we were level. And then we can go ahead and start clicking nose down. Oh, sorry, I forgot to change our altitude first. So we want to go down to 7,600, then vertical speed, then we're going to go ahead and descend. We're a little high. That's okay. The next waypoint, if you remember, is also, actually no, it's down to 6,800 feet. So we're going to want to get down to 6,800 feet. You can see that just swapped over. The 6,800 feet is where we want to be at. So we're going to need to set our altitude to 6,800, and then vertical speed, same again, we need to drop that down. Now you can see there are some purple arrows here. That is if we were to do what's called VNAV, which would have avoided what the mistake I just made, but like I said, we're not going to completely go over that because you're not always going to have vertical navigation. But you can see what I did is I lined up my descent with roughly that arrow. You can see vertical speed is now this V, and this will be or you'll see that starting to come down as we get closer to 6,800 feet. This will swap over to a G once we really get on to more of a closer point to the approach. We can go ahead and turn on approach now because we don't really have any more major turns to do. And so if we click on approach, that is actually going to load up so that way we'll have our vertical speed for when we are on the glide path. You can see GP is now up here. It's not green, so it's not active. It hasn't captured it, I should say. So we're leveling off at 6,800 feet. We did that a little early, as you can see, because the vertical speed is, or sorry, the vertical for VNAV is still up a little bit, but you'll see that we're going to start to catch that up. Let's go ahead and look back up, and it is a very hazy, cloudy, overcasted morning. So we're coming up to about 30 seconds to the next waypoint. Once we hit this one, we should see that this should turn to a G. There it is. And there's our glide path, this little diamond. So the reason why they had us set 6,800 feet is because we want to be below that glide path as we hit it. You can see we just captured it. So now the aircraft is going to start descending on its own all the way down to the runway. I like to hit the barometric pressure button again just to make sure that we're at the correct altitude. That beeping is that we are at the outer marker for the airport. So we want to go ahead and start slowing down here. On your main PDF on your airspeed ribbon, if we come down and have a look at that, this white arc is where you can start introducing flaps. So we want to slow down so that we can start introducing our flaps. We're looking for about 70-75 knots for our speeds to have a nice descent Fort Collins. But we're lined up. You can see on here that we are lined up horizontally, and we are on the glide path, and we are descending right where we should be. So we're in a good position. Bring a little bit of throttle back in and drop down the first notch of flaps, which would be down here, and you can just go ahead and click that in. That'll start slowing our speed down a little bit. You can now just barely see the lights of the airport. Start bringing that throttle back in. We're going a little slow. We just passed the Judith waypoint, which is our last waypoint before we hit the runway. We'll go ahead and hit our second notch of flaps. I'm going to bring that speed up a little bit. Now, you don't want to have your autopilot take you all the way to the runway because it's just going to slam you into the ground. So you're going to turn that off when you're just a little bit, well, really you turn it off at your minimums, which we look at a chart to find those out. We're going to go ahead and third notch of flaps. Now it's a little hard to make out here. Zoom in. These are called poppy lights. You can see we have 2 red, 2 white. That means we're on the glide path. If this was to have 4 red, we're too low, 4 white, we're too high. Coming up into my landing view here. Now I'm going to go ahead and disengage the autopilot. And we're going to start to slow down even more. We're over the runway, we can come to idle. This is where you want to kind of start your flare. We had a little bit of ground effect there. Come in, touch down, try and remain on that center line, and start applying our brakes. You don't have to slam on the brakes, you just want to slow down. And there, we're just going to go ahead and bring up our flaps. And here we are at exit. Go ahead and turn off onto this taxiway. And that's all it is. That's literally how you would just do a nice, simple flight plan with an approach loaded to guide you through those clouds that we had to deal with. And once we're beyond the threshold of the runway here, all you would do is go through and you want to turn off your sort of strobe lights. You want to turn off your nav lights, but you're going to keep on your beacon lights, and you turn off your landing light but turn on your taxi light. You'd also want to turn off your transponder, which in here is there, and then you can set that to standby. And that would be like, you don't have to necessarily do that, but that is the real world procedure for once you exit the runway. So I hope that helped explain how to use the G1000 to input a flight plan, load an approach, and how to fly that approach. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. And until next time, this is Sprocket Simulations wishing you happy flights and silky smooth landings. I would really appreciate it if you like and subscribe. Have a good one.